Hollywood's golden age, a time of glitz, glamour, and the rise of some of film's most prolific stars. A time when movies were made that would go on to stand the test of time as untouchable classics with unproblematic. A time of song and dance, where films were made to entertain all, with no negative stereotypes. The golden age of Hollywood was a deeply troubled time. While it produced some of the most recognizable films in cinema history, it was not without its seedy underbelly. Sexist, racist, and homophobic men primarily ran the studios, and many of the era's stars both behind and in front of the cameras were no different. Perhaps the most famous face from silent cinema is no exception to this, leaving behind a legacy of brutal productions and a surprisingly public affinity for very young women. Today, we're going to take a look at the dark side of Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was born on April 16, 1889, in London, England. He came from a family of entertainers, his father a music hall entertainer, and his mother a singer. He would first take the stage at the age of 5 while filling in for his mother, and by the age of 8 he became a professional performer with a group of cloggers. He would take on a variety of entertainment styles, stage plays, vaudeville, and pantomime, before he made it to Hollywood while on tour with the troupe. There, in 1913, he was discovered and signed by Mack Sennett's Keystone Studios. In 1914, he made his second film with the studio, Kid Otto Races at Venice, where he debuted his iconic Little Tramp character, also referred to as just Tramp. It is this character that would skyrocket Chaplin to fame, making him one of the most beloved actors in all of silent film. It's also the image you probably see when you think of Charlie Chaplin: tiny mustache, bowler hat, cane, and ill-fitting clothes and shoes. After 4 months of apprenticeship, Chaplin would soon begin to write and direct his own films. He would develop his own styles and techniques to bring his stories to life in eloquent fashion in the still new medium of film. In 1921, Chaplin released The Kid, starring himself and Jackie Coogan. The film would go on to become one of the most successful films ever at the time, and has since gone down in cinema history. As the industry moved towards talkies, Chaplin's City Lights in 1931 performed well even though it was a silent film, albeit with a score and sound effects. But by 1936, he would both give in to the move towards sound and say farewell to the Tramp character in the film Modern Times. In this film, audiences would hear the Tramp's voice for the first and last time as he sings a gibberish song while performing a dance routine. In 1940, Chaplin released The Great Dictator, his first real talkie. The film was a satire and social commentary on the time, criticizing and poking fun at the Nazis, and Chaplin taking on the role of a Hitler-like character. Oddly, Chaplin and Hitler were born the very same week, and their resemblance to one another had been noticed by the public at least the year before, primarily them sharing an affinity for the toothbrush mustache. The Great Dictator would go on to be a great success, and has since been lauded as a masterpiece. Over the course of his career, Chaplin would write over 80 films, many of which are considered classics of the medium, and his comedy styling of physical slapstick humor mixed with the more subtle, character-driven acting would go on to inspire the comedy greats that followed. For someone with such a prolific career, it might not be all that surprising to learn that Charlie Chaplin was very demanding and controlling on set. As the writer, director, and lead actor in his films, he exerted a lot of control over everyone else on set. He would often only have a basic setup for a movie before filming, resulting in a lot of what was filmed to be improvised. This meant that Chaplin would often film the same scene many different times to capture different outcomes. These hundreds of takes were often grueling for the cast, and presumably for the crew as well. Additionally, it wasn't unheard of for Chaplin to dismiss and replace an actor partway through production if he was unhappy with their performance. Because of his relentless demand for excellence, films he starred in were often overdue and over budget, but audiences loved what they were given, essentially condoning his actions. It also seems that Chaplin was always able to get away with this behavior because he was Charlie Chaplin. Those working on the project knew it would turn out great, but it didn't mean the process was at all pleasant. In Marlon Brando's autobiography published in 1994, he details his experience with the iconic actor, writer, and director, calling him a fearsomely cruel man. In one paragraph, he notes that Chaplin was probably the most sadistic man I'd ever met. He was an egotistical tyrant and a penny pincher. He harassed people when they were late and scolded them unmercifully to work faster. Worst of all, he treated his son Sidney, who played my sidekick, cruelly in front of everybody. He humiliated him constantly. He'd go on to say that the abuse of his son was painful to watch. Brando stated that he himself became the target of Chaplin's ire one day when he was late to set. He demanded an apology from Chaplin, which he was later granted. It wasn't just his on-set behavior that demands us to reconsider Chaplin's legacy. He had not one, not two, but 3 very young wives, 2 of which would be considered child brides. His first wife was 16-year-old Mildred Harris, an actress. The pair married in 1918. when Chaplin would have been 29 years old. It's believed they wed because of a pregnancy scare, which ended up being a false alarm. The couple would have one child, who would sadly die in infancy. The pair divorced just a couple years later in 1920. Chaplin's next child bride would be 16-year-old film star Lita Grey, born Lolita McMurray. Grey first met Chaplin when she was introduced to him at just 6 years old, but the two would work together when Grey was just 12 years old on Chaplin's The Kid. She's credited as Flirtatious Angel on IMDb for that film. It's said that Chaplin's desires towards the young girl were open for all to see. He began having sex with her when she was just 15 years old. Grey would become pregnant, and the pair would marry when she was 16. They too would divorce just 3 years later in 1927. In a 1989 interview, she was asked about Chaplin's penchant for young girls, and she gave a response that seemed to illuminate his grooming behavior. He tried to create people. He enjoyed being the first person in a girl's life. Giving more evidence for his predatory preferences, Chaplin told Vanity Fair in 1926 about his ideal woman, but let's be honest, girl. "I'm not exactly in love with her, but she's entirely in love with me." In 1943, he'd marry his final bride, a barely 18-year-old Una O'Neill, daughter of playwright Eugene O'Neill, when Chaplin was 54 years old. He'd go on to have 8 children with Una, in addition to the 3 other sons, one of which died shortly after birth from previous marriages. Chaplin was made a father again for the last time when he was 73 years old. Despite public attention on his marriages, Chaplin seemingly never faced any legal consequences for his actions in regards to his underage wives. However, his divorce with Lita Grey was quite public. The New York Times Time Machine pulls up nearly 30 articles from 1927 about the divorce. One of those articles includes a quote from Chaplin when asked why he married 2 young girls, Mildred Harris and Lita Grey. His response was that both of the girls gave him a paternal feeling and that you can have the same love and companionship as for your children. It appears that Chaplin's interest in young girls was discussed in the press during his career. When asked what he liked about young girls, it's reported that Chaplin replied, "Something so virginal in their slimness, in their slender arms and legs." Interestingly, it was the Red Scare, not his behavior with underage girls, which would bring about a fall from grace for Chaplin. In 1945, a U.S. senator sponsored a bill that called for an investigation into Chaplin and whether he should be deported for his record of behavior with underage girls. It seems the senator, however, was pro-Nazi and likely retaliating against Chaplin after his Hitler-mocking hit The Great Dictator. Chaplin never became an American citizen, despite spending decades living in the U.S., but he still participated in politics. In 1947, the House of Un-American Activities Committee denounced Chaplin for his communist views. He agreed to be questioned by the committee, but he was never actually called up to do so. It was this move that would cause Chaplin to fall in the eyes of the public. His film Monsieur Verdot, released that same year, bombed at the box office. In 1952, Chaplin made his first trip back to England in over 20 years for the premiere of his film Limelight. Soon after his departure from the US, the Attorney General announced that a full investigation would occur to determine whether Chaplin should be allowed back into the United States. The FBI even called on the British MI5 to help in investigating Chaplin. Chaplin denied ever being a communist, though there's evidence that he at least had some communist sympathies. In order to reobtain entry into the United States, Chaplin would have had to disclose both his personal and political activities. So, Chaplin essentially exiled himself and lived the rest of his life in Switzerland. He died on Christmas Day 1977 at the age of 88 years old. And to this day, Chaplin is still heralded as one of the greatest stars in the history of the silver screen.